Morning Year 12. Today's video lesson is going to be about the role of the detective in crime fiction and also in the murder of Roger Ackroyd. So how today's video lesson will look is we're going to start by looking at the role of the detective in literature as a whole. You are then going to complete some research on the role of the detective. I'd then like you to spend some time reading chapters 9 to 13 of Roger Ackroyd. That will be followed by a discussion of Inspector Raglan and Poirot, focusing on juxtapositioning. And the last thing to complete is some tasks specific to Raglan and Poirot. So to begin, when we're thinking about the role of the detective in literature, we come to think of the detective as being a Sherlock Holmes type figure, so 19th century. However, there's some evidence to suggest that the detective story actually began before Christ, and we see the detective within some stories of the Bible. And the kind of notion of this is that criminals committed crimes which went against the moral code of society. And the role of the detective was to restore order and restore this sense of morality, revealing the criminal and punishing the offender. So, in fact, whilst we might think of the Sherlock Holmes figure as being the first real major detective in literature, it actually has origins way before then. Now, when we do come to think about the detective, as I've already said, we start to think about this really in the late Victorian era. And even before Sherlock Holmes, we have Edgar Allan Poe establishing these conventions for detective fiction. And what Poe established was this figure of the great detective. The great detective solves the mystery of a crime through his observation of the crime scene. He collects relevant information about the victim and then performs profound analysis on this information. So the detective is somebody who's very intelligent. Now, Todorov, a critic, in his study on the typology of detective fiction, describes three main subcategories of the detective genre. The first type, he says, is the whodunit. Now, I know you've already explored what a whodunit is. The second subgenre is the thriller, and the final is the suspense novel. So all of these three subgenres are within the detective story category. Now, I want us to focus on British detective fiction. And what I want us to think about is the golden age of detective fiction specific to Agatha Christie. And just a recap that this started shortly before World War I and continued until World War II. We've got Arthur Conan Doyle, as I've mentioned, as being a really prolific author of the period before the golden age of detective fiction. And following on from Conan Doyle, with the golden age of detective fiction, what we have is the classical whodunit coming through. And what this contains is mystery as the introductory part of the investigation. And then following on from that, the second part of the novel, where we begin to unravel these clues. So when we're thinking about the whodunit specific to Poirot, what the whodunit style is it's characterised by a really mysterious death which seems to violate the natural order of law-abiding citizens. So if we're thinking about King's Abbot as being a seemingly moral setting, we have this crime, the murder of Roger Ackroyd, as violating this moral village. So what it says is that for a time, all must live in its shadow till the fallen one is identified. And with the person's arrest, with the culprit's arrest, innocence is restored and the law retires forever. Now, that's certainly true of the murder of Roger Ackroyd. Another part of the whodunit novel is this notion of duality in stories, and that's opposites, people having dual characters, people almost being kind of split in nature. And What we have with the detective within a whodunit is somebody who typically is quite an eccentric man. So somebody like Sherlock Holmes or Poirot, who, as you will have read already, is a chronic detailer. The most minute of details Poirot seems to be able to pick up on. In addition to this, every great detective has a partner who seems to alleviate this extremeness in character, and they are the detective's counterpart. Now, the counterpart explains, records, and narrates the story, and we might see the counterpart within Roger Ackroyd as being Dr. Shepherd. Now, what I'd like you to do is pause the video at this point, and I've put on the slide a link to an article focusing on the role of the detective in crime fiction. So I'd like you to go ahead and read that article and answer the questions that are on the PowerPoint below. Okay, once you've done that, what I would advise you to do is pause the video again at this point and go away and complete the reading for this week. If you need to pick the video back up again at a later date, that's absolutely fine. So what I'd like you to read this week are chapters 9 to 13. And when you're doing this, what would be brilliant is if you could summarise, as you have been doing, the key events of each chapter. Okay, now you've read chapters 9 to 13, what I'd really like us to focus on are chapters 9 and 10 and the presentation of Poirot and Inspector Raglan. Now, what we see with these characters are two very different detectives, and that's really significant. So when we meet Poirot, we're given the impression of him through the eyes of Dr. Shepherd, and the impression that we get is that he's a very curious man. He's someone to be intrigued by, and ultimately is very eccentric. Now, that fits with the profile given of detectives within Golden Age crime and whodunits, as we mentioned earlier. Now, what's to note is that through Dr. Shepherd's eyes, Poirot may be eccentric and a little bit odd due to him being from abroad. So we're never told in the text where he's from in the chapters 9 and 10, but we understand that he is not British. Now, with Raglan, on the other hand, he appears at least to be respected by the community. So you'll notice the characters of King's Abbot trusting Raglan and kind of relying on him in some ways, but then in other ways with Poirot being more suspicious of his methods and his techniques. So what Christie's doing is juxtaposing these two detectives in terms of how they're presented through Shepherd's narrative voice, but also through their own methods of detection. We've got Raglan, who appears very bumbling and foolish, but Poirot, as mentioned earlier, as being very interested in the intricacies of crime and being quite cerebral in his thinking. So, what I'd like you to do for today is return to chapters 9 and 10. And what I'd like you to think about is the presentation of Poirot and the presentation of Raglan. So, as detectives, how does Christie describe them both, and why do you think that is? Once you've thought about them both as individuals, what I'd like you to do is compare those two presentations and write about how and why Christie might have juxtaposed the two. What does she want the reader to feel about them both? And ultimately, what does she want us to feel about Shepherd through his comments on both detectives? Remember, the perspective is of Shepherd's. It's not necessarily of the whole of King's Abbot. So we're really seeing it through Shepherd's eyes. So we're thinking about Poirot as a detective and his methods. How is he being presented? And then we're thinking about Raglan as a detective and his methods. If you need any help, please just contact me. That's absolutely fine. And when you have finished, you can upload the work to Teams or through email if that is easier. Thank you.